Good morning. I'm Ron Volkmer, and I am Professor Emeritus, having taught at Creighton University School of Law. And I have the honor this morning of interviewing the Honorable Joseph D. Bataillon of the United States District Court for the District of Nebraska. Judge Bataillon has taken senior status and has graciously consented to be a part of the Eighth Circuit's Historical Society's series of interviews with judges of the Eighth Circuit. Good morning, Joe.
Hi, Ron. It's just a pleasure to be interviewed by one of my personal heroes and a man that has influenced my life so greatly. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Joe. You know, Joe and I have family connections going back a long ways, actually. But again, the purpose of this interview is to give you some background with regard to Judge Bataillon's career as an attorney and then as a federal district court judge. And Joe, I know that your family is very important to you, so why don't you introduce to everyone the members of your immediate family?
So my wife, Pamela, and I have been married since 1971, and we have 5 children, and they're spread across the country. So my oldest, Amy, is a lawyer here in Omaha. The next is Jared. He is a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and is an executive in a startup company and doing some more education, as a matter of fact. And then my middle daughter, Margie, has just moved from California to Bend, Oregon, and she's a photographer and mother of 3 kids. Next is Patrick. Pat is a political operative, I think I would call him. 2 daughters, and they live in Chicago. And then finally, my daughter, Catherine, works for the clerk's office, the county clerk's office, and does wedding licenses. So if anybody needs to get married, they should just go down and see Catherine. And then, of course, my parents, Frank and Jean Bataillon, come from Nebraska City. Frank's 95 and still living here in the Omaha area.
Yes, I'm familiar with your father. He and I go back to high school days when I was in high school in Nebraska City. So, Joe, let's go back to Arbor Day celebration time and recall our history of growing up in Nebraska City, with emphasis on your growing up on North 3rd Street down there in Nebraska City.
Well, we were just a couple of blocks from the high school and grade school that you and I both attended. And my dad was a postal carrier and liked to volunteer at the school a lot. He was your track coach and my gym teacher from time to time. And we just had a great time. It was a wonderful place. Nebraska City Lourdes was the school that we both graduated. And it was a great place run by the Ursuline nuns, who could be rather harsh. And I'm sure none of them ever said this to you, but after I won the state oratorical contest, my speech teacher told me that she wasn't sure I could get into college.
Well, that's a new one, Joe. I hadn't heard that about your history, so I'm going to be learning something new about you as we proceed with this interview. So yes, in Nebraska City, you and I grew up very close to the church and the school, and were taught by the Ursuline nuns, and you graduated from St. Mary's grade school, and then you took a little bit different turn.
Yes, they talked me into trying to be a priest, so I went down to, in the same order as your brother, as a matter of fact. So I went down to Liberty, Missouri, just outside of Kansas City, and was a freshman in high school down there. I was the class barber, and tried my hand at being a seminarian for about a year, and then decided that Nebraska City Lourdes would give me a better chance, and I probably would compete better with that educational opportunity as opposed to the seminary.
So you came back to Nebraska City at Lourdes Central High School, and I guess, you know, back in those days, it was a small school, so you did everything, right? Athletics and dramatics and the whole 9 yards.
The whole 9 yards. I mean, you were there. I mean, you played 8-man football, right?
Actually, it started the year after I
graduated. So you didn't get to do it. Oh. Well, you were a track star, so we needed you badly when I was there. I think my team went 0-1 and maybe 9. So, you know, everybody did football, everybody did basketball, everybody did track. And then you were president of your class one time or another. And then we all did speech competition and did a lot of speech competition, as a matter of fact.
Drama and speech was a huge part of the Lord's education that affected a lot of us in a very positive way. So we can thank those Ursuline nuns for
Absolutely.
starting us on our career. Joe, decision to go to college, was that difficult or was that?
Well, you went to college, my uncle went to college, and my mother's siblings all went to school. And so I think it was expected of us that we were going to go to college. And I had to decide where to go to school. And believe it or not, at the time, the tuition at Nebraska and the tuition at Creighton was about the same. It's hard to believe
That
these
is hard
days.
to believe.
And Creighton accepted me first, and I just jumped at the chance. And I was very happy to go to Creighton University.
So you lived in the dorm?
Absolutely, Degelman Hall.
Of course, you had to decide at some point which you're going to major in.
Yes, and I don't think there was really any question. I wanted to be a lawyer. When I was deciding whether I wanted to be a priest or not, I had to decide, what my talents were. And I felt like it was best suited to being a lawyer. So I kind of had my way set for me. It was either be a priest or be a lawyer. I decided to be a lawyer, and so I went to Creighton and then majored in political science, did a minor in philosophy, and then I talked Dean Schwiezo into keeping me out of a science requirement by going to business school, and then I had a minor in business administration.
Another interesting fact about Judge Batallion's career at Creighton. So, Joe, I know also during that time there was ROTC at Creighton.
Yes, it was mandatory. We all wore the uniform from freshman year. That was our physical ed requirement. So the Vietnam War was going on then, and I did the first 2 years of ROTC, and I knew I wanted to go to law school, but the war at that time was ramping up, and I was told in no uncertain terms that if I wanted to go to law school, I'd have to join ROTC and sign up for the Army. And so I did that, and then the rest is history. I finished my ROTC my senior year, was commissioned, then got a deferment for law school, and then after law school had to do my officer basic in military police.
Right, and I think during that period of time, your kind of long-standing affiliation with Creighton basketball also took off, so to speak.
Yes, so I was able to finance my first year of undergraduate through my family. And the second year, it became more than they could handle. And so they said, you should apply for some financial assistance from Creighton. And part of the financial assistance was a work-study program. So I was assigned to the basketball department, the athletic department. And I was basically a jack-of-all-trades clerk in the basketball department. Red McManus was the coach. And I got put into the sports information business. I think Stu Erickson was the sports information director at that time. And then Dan Offenberger came the following year, along with Eddie Sutton. So I worked for Coach McManus and then Coach Sutton through my undergraduate career as work study. And I worked in the sports information office. And so I learned a little bit about that business. And then when I went to law school, the athletic director at that time was Dan Offenberger, and he gave me a job as the equipment manager and assistant student manager. So nowadays, I think there's like 5 or 6 or maybe 10 student managers on the basketball team. Back in those days, there was one full-time, and then I was part-time, and then I managed the equipment. I managed the equipment because I was in law school and I could say no to the basketball players. And I think they paid me all of $500 a year to be the equipment manager.
I understand that after graduating and going to law school, there was an important event in your life.
Pamela Don Nelson Battalion. Yes, Pamela was a nursing student that I met in my sophomore year, and she was the love of my life. And so I had to persuade her that it was okay to get married early in life as opposed to waiting till later in life. And I promised her that I would make sure that she did everything she wanted to do if she would have been single. And so she reluctantly agreed to get married to me. And then we got married after my senior year and before my freshman year in law school.
Okay, so you headed to Creighton Law School, which back then was at 26th in California in the old law school building.
We were the last class to graduate from the old law school.
And so I know you were very active in law school, participating in numerous events, including moot court and other things, correct?
Yeah, I was on the moot court team, the national team and the local team as well. And then someone charitably let me on the law school as a law review as a staff editor. Thank you very much. I helped write a law review article on public defender services with Bennett Hornstein, who was another hero in my life. And I got elected to the student board of governors and was on the student board of governors for the Creighton University for a while. And that was interesting as a law student as opposed to being a regular student in the university system. So I just had a great experience in law school. It was one of the best times of my life.
So now you're graduating from Creighton Law School. You have a military commitment ahead of you.
So I had to do an officer basic course. I had an active duty commitment with the Army, but the Vietnam War was winding down by the time I graduated from law school, so they changed my commitment, and I didn't have to do an active duty phase, but I had to do officer basic training. So Pam and I went to Augusta, Georgia, and did military police officer basic training. And the funny story, and I met a lot of wonderful people there. There were lawyers that were in the military police class that were in the same boat that I was in. And so it was a great experience for me, not so much for my wife, but for me it was fun. And then after that, then I had made an agreement with the public defender, Frank Morrison, that I would help him with his campaign for Attorney General. I had law clerked for the public defender's office in my senior year of law school. And then from that developed a relationship with former Governor Morrison, and who was then at that time the chief public defender for Douglas County. So when I came back, I started working for his campaign. It was an ill-fated campaign, and after the campaign, he hired me as a lawyer in the public defender's office.
So your first kind of, dare I say, real job in the law was working in the public defender's office here in Douglas County, Nebraska.
Right. So initially, it was not a law job. So I had a background in political science, of course, and the public defender's office at that time had a program that gave jobs to people that were offenders, and tried to convince judges that if these individuals had gainful employment, that they would be fit candidates for probation. And it was done in conjunction with the local AFL-CIO here in Omaha and Douglas County. And I was charged with doing interviews of defendants who had successfully done the program and who were applying for the program, and then try to do a study to determine whether or not the program should be continued, because I believe it was under an LEAA grant from the federal government. And that was a great learning experience for me, to meet offenders of all backgrounds and understand their situation and how it interplayed in the criminal justice system.
I can offer an editorial comment here, as I think that background is very significant as you assumed your role on the federal bench, particularly in the area of criminal law and sentencing and all of that. But that's one thing about your career that I thought was particularly interesting, that you started in the public defender office, but doing this almost like non-traditional job for the public defender, which I thought was quite innovative, and we're still talking today about, recidivism and how we can prevent that. So interesting to me that, again, literally your first jump into the legal system was in a, as I say, kind of a non-traditional way, but one which gave you great insights with regard to the criminal defendants that were being arraigned in Douglas County, Nebraska. So at that time you were also starting a family, and of course I assume life was quite busy and hectic in terms of your growing family and your job in the public defender's office. That had to be quite busy.
It was quite busy. Pam was still working as a nurse. She worked for the Visiting Nurse Association, and I was working in the public defender's office. We both had kind of like a parallel career. So she worked as a public health nurse and a visiting nurse, and then became a team leader. And then after she became team leader, she became the chief operating office for the Visiting Nurses Association and became the director of the Potawatomi County Visiting Nurses Association, and was management. And at the same time, I started in the misdemeanor section in the public defender's office, and that's where you start. You walk in the door, and they introduce you to the judges on the first afternoon, and then the next day they give you a stack of files and say, go try cases. And so that's what we did. And then I became the head of the misdemeanor section, and then after that I did preliminary hearings. And then after preliminary hearings, I moved to the juvenile section, and then after the juvenile section to the felony section. And all the while, I helped Bennett Hornstein with appeals, and then I handled my own appeals to the Nebraska Supreme Court. So I got a really great, diverse experience about what the practice of law was in the public defender's office.
So I believe you told me, Joe, that was like for 6 years.
It was roughly 6 years. So I started in 1974, in the fall of 1974, and then I moved into private practice in January, the end of January in 1980.
So now your career takes a different avenue, and that is in the private practice. That began with Emil Sidoro's law firm?
I interviewed with him, and he was generous enough to offer me a position in his law firm. So in Emil's office, you get cases and you're on your own, and you have to try the cases. He sent me to Fred Lane's trial school in Chicago to teach me how to try civil cases, because of course the burden of proof is different and the sophistication of the defendants is a lot different than it is in the criminal business. And so I started doing general civil work, personal injury litigation, construction litigation, insurance contract litigation. And then the law firm changed after I was there for about a year, and a number of the senior partners left, and it became a new entity. And with that, my responsibility increased, so I took over a lot of the work that the senior partners did. And initially, I was doing workers' compensation work, and then when we found a workers' compensation lawyer, then I started doing professional negligence, mostly medical malpractice defense and legal malpractice defense.
I guess you were trying cases, in rural Nebraska and urban Nebraska and all over, correct?
Yes, we tried cases in Iowa as well. So I tried cases in Sioux City and Council Bluffs. I had cases in Glenwood, and then all the way as far as Scotts Bluff, we tried cases. So it was a very regional practice as opposed to just the city of Omaha. I had an opportunity to meet lawyers all over the state. When I started in private practice, my old chief deputy at the public defender's office, Larry Corrigan, introduced me to the State Bar Association. And then I started working in the House of Delegates, I think within a year after I started in private practice. And that was one of the greatest experiences that I've had as well.
Having, experience, particularly in the trial court, I assume that you felt that you were very well equipped to go to the bench, but of course going to the federal bench is a matter not easy to do in terms of having someone to more or less sponsor you and get your connections so that you're able to be in a position to be appointed to that position.
Well, Governor Morrison got me involved in wholesale politics. And before that, I was involved in politics in undergraduate and the law school. Partisan politics as well as nonpartisan politics. Did some campaigns for some people. But Governor Morrison really did kind of introduce me to it. And then from that point on, I was involved in Democratic politics locally and statewide. was the state party chair at that time, toward the end of my private practice career, and it was substantially interfering with my ability to continue to work. I mean, I think I had finally overcommitted myself, and so I was getting to the point where I needed to do something different as far as my career was concerned, and the opportunity to get on the federal bench came up, and I was the right age, I had the right experience. It was a time in my career when I wanted to do something different than the way I was practicing law up to that point. And so I talked to Senator Kerry and Senator Exon and asked them if it would be okay for me to put my name into the hopper. So when you're the state chair, you have an obligation to the organization. And if they would have told me that they wanted me to stay as state chair, I certainly would have done that. But they were very generous and said that they were willing to let me consider this option. And so I put my name in and was lucky enough to be one of the people, the person that was chosen to be nominated to the president. And so I'm forever grateful to both Senator Kerry and Senator Exon.
And so it would have been President William Clinton who actually nominated you?
Yes. So the two senators submit some names to the president, and then the president can vet those names. And in this cycle, the two senators decided just to send one person because they thought that the nomination process would be expedited as a result of that.
Because it was an election year, there was a concern about getting your nomination through the Senate.
So I was nominated, and when the senators agreed on me, then I resigned as a state chair because I couldn't do political work and be considered for this nomination. And then I was vetted by the White House and then nominated by the president to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And then it was just a question of whether I could get into the queue and get through in time before the presidential election. And I did have a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in July of that election year. But unfortunately, I didn't get through the committee process. They never had a vote on us. And then my nomination died. And then I had to be renominated after President Clinton was reelected, and then go through the process all over again. Senator Hagel then had taken Senator Exon's place, and Senator Hagel was very gracious. I had an interview with him, and he was very generous, I thought, to allow my nomination to proceed forward.
There was actually a position that was available that did not go to you that you did apply for, is that
right? I had applied for Judge Shanahan's spot, and that's when President Clinton was first elected. And so I went through the nomination process. There was a committee that screened the applicants. And, it's a little hard to compete with a sitting Supreme Court justice.
Well, I'm quite familiar with the Honorable Thomas Shanahan, and I must say, Joe, it's no disgrace to be behind the Honorable Thomas Shanahan, who unfortunately just served a short period of time on the federal district bench here. So after President Clinton is reelected, you're now before the Senate again, and this time the nomination goes through. And so there's an opportunity for you to join the bench. And so now we come to another phase of your career when you join the federal district court here in the District of Nebraska. And I guess it was, in terms of stepping into a new arena, there was kind of a new cast of characters that you became familiar with.
A brand new cast of characters. So I was in the old federal courthouse, and they didn't really have room for me. Judge Shanahan's job, his position, was a temporary judgeship that was created that added an extra judgeship for Nebraska. So we previously had 3 permanent judgeships. A temporary judgeship was added. That was Judge Shanahan. So now all 3 of the courts were full. And then I came on to replace Judge Strom. He had chambers that was available for him. And then they moved me into the appeals court in the old building. And so my first office was the abandoned library on the top floor of the federal courthouse. And then I sat on a bench that had three seats for the appellate judges. And then they fashioned a chambers for me in the back, and finally I was able to get into some chambers.
So now you're sitting as a federal district court judge, and Joe, what I found fascinating with regard to, your public service commitment, beyond a very busy, schedule as with your docket, I guess that the Judicial Conference of the United States just kind of appeared on the scene, which opened a big door for you.
Right. Well, we do baby judges school the first year that we're in office, and the Federal Judicial Center has seminars that are mentored by older judges who try to show you what it is to be a federal judge and how the system works, and how they perform their operations and how other judges around the country operate. And my mentor judge was a judge from Minneapolis, Jim Rosenbaum, who ultimately became who was at that time a member of the Space and Security Committee for the Federal Judicial Conference, later became our representative for the Eighth Circuit to the Judicial Conference, and then went on the Executive Committee on his way to being Chief Judge of the District of Minnesota. Judge Rosenbaum was a wonderful man. He recognized that I was interested in doing something other than just judging. I think that he was instrumental in getting me on the then Space and Security Committee when he rotated off. And so I got on the Space and Security Committee, I think within 2 years of when I was put on the bench. And that was the beginning of my career with the Judicial Conference committee structure. And that's been very rewarding.
You were on two very important committees, as I understand it.
Yeah, so I started with the Space and Security Committee, and the Space and Facilities Committee was the originator, but then it was folded in with security at one point. So we did all of the space for the Judicial Conference, and we did security. Later, the Judicial Conference decided to split the committee, and when we split the committee, I stayed with the space side, and then a separate security committee was created. And well, there were reasons for that, but at any rate, so I stayed on the space committee. And then there's a subcommittee in the space committee that does space standards. So we have a uniform guide that sets forth the amount of spaces that different courts need when they build new courthouses and when they do remodeling. And I was on the chair of that subcommittee, and then from there they made me the chair of the Space and Facilities Committee, where I had an opportunity to testify in front of Congress, as a matter of fact, and that was an exhilarating experience. And then when my term as chair of the Space Committee ended, I was asked by the Chief Justice to be on the Budget Committee, and I've been on the Budget Committee ever since.
So those are two very important committees, because I assume all the federal district court judges are pleading for more space, more budget, and your job is to tell them no?
My job is to tell them what they can expect.
That part of your role is, again, something which the public doesn't see. I mean, you have your cases on your docket, but this is important work that needs to be done. And certainly in terms of space here, we're sitting in this magnificent courthouse here in Omaha that I assume while you were on the bench, this building was being designed and planned as well.
And it was built in conformity with the then design guide that Judge Rosenbaum, he was the chair of the subcommittee for space, and helped develop the first design guide. And then I followed in his footsteps and helped design the next iteration of the design guide. And since I've rotated off of the committee, now we have a new iteration of the design guide. But it's to set what the limits are of space and what the requirements are for space, so that the court can continue to operate in the fashion that it has over the centuries.
Okay, so now I'd like to switch to kind of what your day job is, and that is the presiding judge in the United States District Court. And of course, lots of challenges there with regard to, I assume, the criminal docket that we read a lot about, and sentencing, I guess in terms of your career as having this background as the public defender and all of that, you obviously were taking criminal cases and doing your share of sentencing. And I guess you told me that your reputation as Let 'em Go Joe was well-deserved. Is that right?
I don't know about that. The marshals gave me that moniker. I was sentencing generally less than my colleagues, apparently. And as a result of that, I got that nickname.
Judge Robert Pratt's case went to the United States Supreme Court in Gaul, which I guess made your job a little bit easier in terms of sentencing.
There were a number of us that were trying to convince our colleagues that the mandatory sentencing guidelines were unconstitutional for a number of reasons, and frankly unworkable. I decided a case early in my career in 2004 that was cited by a number of my colleagues, at least in the Eighth Circuit. And then there were a series of cases that followed developments by the Supreme Court on this issue. And ultimately, Judge Pratt's case, Gaul, followed a case where I was reversed similar to his reversal. And that case went to the Supreme Court. And finally, the Supreme Court instructed the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals that they had to follow the Booker opinion. And that the sentencing guidelines were in fact advisory, and that the circuit had to defer to the decision-making of the trial court, generally speaking. And so that brought us into the modern era of sentencing that we have today.
So on the civil side, when we chatted a bit about your docket, I guess the case involving the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, which the Nebraska voters voted for, and it came before you, which basically raises the issue of same-sex marriage. I suppose in terms of a headliner case, that's the one that the public probably focused on the most. And I guess over a period of time, I dare say, at least according to the majority of the Supreme Court, your opinion was vindicated. So what was your feelings about that case when it was assigned to you and the subsequent developments?
Well, the cases are assigned randomly, so I had no idea that the case was assigned to me until we started working it up, and then it became obvious that decisions had to be made. We, the decisions, the questions of same-sex marriage have been developing, all the way back to Loving, and it seemed to me apparent that same-sex marriage should be protected. And we wrote an opinion. Most of the court has settled on an equal protection theory. I thought that it had more to do than with simple equal protection. And I wrote an opinion accordingly. And it was promptly reversed by the circuit. And I knew that sooner or later we would have to come to this issue, and that if the Supreme Court followed the case progression as it's worked over the years, that sooner or later we would be there. I just didn't realize it would take so long. So I think my decision was in 2006, and it wasn't until 2015 that Obergefell was decided. So I was the first district court that decided that same-sex marriage was appropriate. I believe that all of my trial colleagues decided the same as time went on. And then it was finally the Supreme Court that decided that and set the law with respect to same-sex marriage. And shortly before Obergefell was decided, another case came to us on the same issue. Waters, I believe, Waters versus Ricketts, and I decided that case in, I think, May or April before Obergefell was decided. So I think I was the first district judge to decide that same-sex marriage was constitutional, and the last district court judge to decide that same-sex was constitutional.
Are there any other cases, Judge Bataillon, that, in your career that kind of stand out for you?
There were a few petition cases. So most states are really not interested in having a very easy petition process, and Nebraska is no different than that. So there was a number of cases that came to this court about the petition process, and I decided that petition process could be accomplished by people from outside the state of Nebraska. So if a petitioner wanted to petition for a ballot initiative, that they could hire people from the outside to come and do the petition process as opposed to what was provided by state law at that time. I also decided that the prohibition of Nebraska law that said that you could not pay paid petitioners on the number of signatures that they obtained was appropriate, and that was a reasonable limitation on the petition process. So there's 2 or 3 petition cases that I decided that I thought were appropriate and met constitutional muster as to the restrictions and the ability of citizens to petition their state government.
You mentioned earlier about your longstanding work and affiliation with the Nebraska State Bar Association, and you were in the House of Delegates, as I was for a number of years, and you were tapped for a leadership role. And I guess, in terms of, again, your public service, you rose to be honored to be the president of the Nebraska State Bar Association.
The Bar Association is an interesting organization. There aren't all of our colleagues interested in participating in an organizational structure, and I was lucky enough to get involved and meet some great folks. And then when I was in private practice, I was chair of the House of Delegates and got on the executive committee and really understood how the Bar Association operated and met some wonderful people from across the state. And then when you become an active judge, you really are pretty much ethically precluded, I think, from being the president of the Bar Association, mostly because I think it takes up so much of your time. And so you have an obligation to be a full-time judge. And if you're the president of the Bar Association, it's the appearance that you're not really a full-time judge. So when I became a senior judge, I became a quote-unquote volunteer for the federal bench. And I felt that it would be appropriate for me to serve in another leadership role in the Bar Association. So when people asked if I would be president, I agreed and was president of the Bar Association then for a year.
And I believe Judge Strom was also.
Yes, he set the mold for me. Yes. My predecessor, Judge Strom, when he took senior status, was president of the Bar Association. Well, he might have done it when he was an active judge. I can't recall for sure. But he did set the mold, and I talked to him, and he told me that it was something that was certainly doable, and I'm glad I followed his advice.
So I know in conjunction, with my activities at Creighton Law School, I know you were very active at Creighton Law School. Again, in addition to everything else you were doing, you were assisting the dean in any way you could and providing opportunities for judicial interns, which I know a number of them went through your court as an intern and found that to be a very valuable experience.
Yeah, I was on the advisory committee and the alumni advisory committee. So we didn't have any power or anything, but it was certainly an opportunity to interface with the law school and understand what the law school was doing for students. So I'm not a traditionalist in respect to law clerks. So most federal judges have 2 or 3 law clerks. One is a career law clerk that generally stays with the judge throughout the judge's career, or at least for a long period of time. And then the other 1 or 2 are called term law clerks, usually students that come from Creighton. So when I came on the bench, it was my plan to do exactly the same thing. But at the time, our caseload was one of the highest in the country. And our criminal caseload was very high as well. And so I thought it was really important to have lawyers on my staff as opposed to lawyers in training, which are law clerks. And then that just developed into having career law clerks. But at the same time, by hiring qualified law clerks who both were, over the years, legal writing instructors, I thought that it was imperative that we mentor law students. And so we've always mentored at least one law student from Creighton and try to do 2 law students at any given time. So we've mentored law students from Creighton and the University of Nebraska. In fact, we've mentored some law schools from law schools as far away as Vermont, the Notre Dame, California, and had some wonderful experience with some very, very talented law students, and then help them with their careers as time goes along. So I started with Therese Bowlerup, and she was my career law clerk. And then she decided to work for the clerk's office and became the chief deputy clerk of the court for the District of Nebraska. And Jeannie Burke, who was a former law clerk, decided, a former law clerk for a number of judges, decided to be a law clerk for me. And then that evolved into the 2 permanent law clerks that I have. And Melinda Cummings has been with me for a long time, and Maura Kennedy, and frankly, they're the behind-the-scenes brain trust that makes me look like I'm a competent federal district court judge.
And so you make a decision at some point along the line here, Judge Bataillon, to take senior status. Was that an easy decision, or had that was that a result of Pam's urging, or how did that come about?
Well, it's a resource decision, really. So every district court has a number of active judges, and that's set by statute. If you become a senior judge, then you give your court an opportunity to add a judge if you continue your service as a senior judge. So it basically reduces the caseload for your colleagues. It makes the justice system more effective because judges have more time to make considerations of cases. And so I thought that when it was time for me to take senior status, that I should, and contribute to the court, frankly. And I was confident that there would be a replacement that would be my equal, and I don't have any question about that. My colleague, Judge Rossiter, took my place. I practiced with his dad. I knew him as a practicing lawyer. He was scheduled to be the president of the Nebraska Bar Association before he became an active judge, and gave that up so that he could be a judge with our court. I carried a full caseload of criminal and civil cases until he was able to be confirmed. And then after he became confirmed, then I cut back my practice. And so I tried to do just civil cases as opposed to criminal cases, and started from there.
One of the things that you were able to do as senior status judge is kind of volunteer your services wherever you're needed, and you ended up being sent to Delaware?
When you're a senior judge, you have an opportunity to travel outside your district, and to keep your staff, you have to keep your caseload up. And so when I decided to drop out of the criminal docket, it was imperative, I thought, for me to help my colleagues around the country and keep my caseload up so I could keep my staff and be a contributor. So I talked to the chief judge of the District of Delaware about taking some cases in Delaware, and he was very generous and agreed that I could do that. And shortly after he agreed that I could take maybe 10 or 15 cases and help the Delaware docket, the 2 active judges in Delaware took senior status and then retired. So they have 4 active judges, 2 retired, and left the bench before their replacements came on board, so they went to half strength. So the chief judge called me and said, "Do you think you would consider taking a few more than 10 or 15 cases?" And so I thought, well, it's a great opportunity. I have family that lives in that general vicinity, and so it would be an opportunity. So much to my staff's chagrin, I ended up taking about 170 or 80 cases from the Delaware court until they were able to get a full complement of judges. And now I'm back to like 10 or so.
You also had an experience maybe sitting en banc with the Court of Appeals?
Yeah, so when you take senior status, there are some circuit courts around the country that have extremely heavy caseloads, and the Ninth Circuit is one. And so I volunteered to take cases with the Ninth Circuit, and I usually take three days of cases a year in the Ninth Circuit. The trouble is, because of COVID, that we've done all of the last 2 years of hearings remotely.
Well, that's a shame that you don't get to, you and your staff travel to California, Judge Bataillon, as we kind of wind down here, talk about your life off the bench, if there's any aspect of your life that, again, gives you some fun and pleasure things.
So, as you know, and as a fellow parishioner of St. Pius X Parish, and an activist yourself, I've been involved in my parish, and I got elected to the parish council and then was the president of the parish council. And the story I like to tell about that is, I had been involved in partisan politics for, 30 years before I got on the parish council, and I thought I knew everything about governing an organization. I was chair of the House of Delegates, knew the parliamentary rules of procedure backwards and forwards, and had dealt with people my whole life, with clients. And then I became a member of the parish council and the parish council president. And I have to tell you, when they say that the Catholic Church invented politics, they're not kidding.
You are a dual citizen of Luxembourg, is that correct?
I am. So my grandmother immigrated from Luxembourg after World War II. She married a doughboy and came back to the United States with him. And so I have immediate relatives that live in Luxembourg, and they would come to Nebraska City once in a while and visit. And I got to know them very well. And my grandmother's niece married a gentleman who was one of the first patent examiners for the European Patent Office. And then I started doing cases in Delaware where I was doing a lot of patent litigation. And he and I became fast friends. And then he told me that, really, I should be a dual citizen of Luxembourg and honor my grandmother's heritage. So he shepherded me through and helped me become a dual citizen.
As we conclude, I would just like to ask you if you have any thoughts about, your legal career in terms of advice you might give to someone thinking about law or once they're in the law. If you have any advice for them in terms of what your career experience you might share with them as kind of parting words of wisdom.
I think you have to be true to yourself and who you are as a person. And I think that you have to pursue things other than just the very specific job that you're doing. You have to have a global view of who you are and how you fit into the world, and then be active in that and participate in that. So as a lawyer, it's really easy to have a very myopic view of what we're all about and what we do and how important we are. But the fact of the matter is that we're just part of society as a whole, and it's important for us, because of our background and training, to participate fully in that endeavor. And so if I had any advice for anybody, it's, get involved in things. Be a participant in your society as a whole. And, if you enjoy your job, then you'll do okay.
Thank you very much, and I guess we can say go Blue Jays, correct?
Go Blue Jays, absolutely. That was my 6-year career.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you very much, Rod.